I suppose, first of all, is it any surprise that the Labour Party is going after government procurement cards? Some of these items sound pretty silly, whether it was that pink photo booth for a Washington, D.C. embassy party, or indeed some of the art that has been installed in government offices. Surely some of this is excessive.
Yeah, I mean, as you said before, there's sort of tens of thousands of items of spending that are detailed here, and some of them are pretty daft, as you say, the photo booth, various bits of spending on kind of cake for team building events and things like this that seem a bit excessive when you look at it. But I think the overall story here is a complete horlicks, really. I mean, Labour have put out this press release saying that spending on these cards has gone up by 70%. But if you actually look at the report they've put out, the so-called GPC files, which makes it sound like Watergate or something, they've got some massive caveats. They haven't included the Ministry of Defence, which accounted for 3/4 of GPC spending the last time they looked at this in 2012. So they just haven't included that department, apparently because of anomalies in the data. They also say that some of the figures for 2022 may include VAT, so another 20% on top of the 2012 figures, which didn't include VAT. And then the mother of all caveats, which is that COVID and inflation have massively increased the spend on these cards. So once you actually factor all of that in, it really isn't the kind of scandal that they'll have us believe. And it certainly isn't. I think Emily Thornberry, Shadow Attorney General, used the phrase the last days of Rome to describe this. I mean, it's ridiculous. They also seem to be implying that ministers themselves have been, spending all this money on our behalf on lavish hotels and stuff. Does anyone seriously think that Rishi Sunak books his own hotels for international conferences and stuff like that? I think, as you said, there are some silly items of spending here. We should obviously be as tight as possible when we're spending taxpayers' money. But the overall impression Labour are trying to create here is completely false, in my opinion.
It is interesting that under pressure this morning, Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, admitted that the Labour Party would still, in some circumstances, hire out five-star hotels for senior figures. And I suppose it only makes sense. If a Prime Minister is going to an international summit, you don't really want them to slum it in some sort of budget drive-through motel.
No, I mean, I enjoy the Travelodge buffet as much as the next man, but I think there are very obvious security reasons as well why senior ministers need to stay in certain types of establishments. There's also, we talk about travel quite a lot, about the PM taking planes instead of trains and things like that. Again, that is partly a security consideration. It's just not possible to work in the way they want to on a train that's going to take 4 or 5 hours. If they can get from A to B more quickly, it's actually a more productive use of their time, and ultimately, I would say, probably offers more value to the taxpayer than having people scuttling around unable to work for hours and hours and hours of their working day. So again, I think with all this stuff, it's always worth going beyond the headline figure and looking at what it's actually telling you. The other point is we're only talking about a certain type of spending here. This is spending on a particular kind of credit card, the government procurement card. It's not about overall spending by the department. So it'd be much more interesting to gauge how that has evolved over the last 10 years, rather than just saying, oh, they're spending more on this particular type of spending. It doesn't really tell us that much.
It's interesting, however, to look at sort of how opposition parties always access this sort of information and make political points of it. There was a request of there was a ministerial question, I believe, from Stuart Jackson, the former MP for Peterborough, back in 2010. We can show on our screens now. This was asking the minister how much had been spent on these cards. £996 million just in 2009 spent on these cards by the last Labour government. I suppose it is sort of the same. Every sort of government will do this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think this was particularly after the expenses scandal, it became very popular to claim that particularly civil servants were kind of indulging themselves on, or council credit cards was another great one back in about sort of 10, 11 years ago. And yeah, as you say, I mean, governments will take pot shots at each other. My concern is that I think this could lead to some fairly silly decision-making processes in the future. If people are terrified that every item of spending is going to be kind of scrutinised in this way, as if it's potentially a frippery or a waste of public money, they might delay or indeed not spend money on things that actually are necessary just because they're worried about potential press coverage in the future. So as I said to you before, I think it's perfectly good, reasonable to scrutinise spending. Worth saying as well, I mean, as Richard Holden said in that clip, the government introduced these rules themselves for allowing for having more transparency about items that were worth £500 or more. So I mean, the idea that they're trying to kind of hide anything, I think, is slightly ridiculous.